Stir up, we beseech thee, O Lord, the wills of thy faithful people, that they, plenteously bringing forth the fruit of good works, may by thee be plenteously rewarded. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Verse 4 of hymn 40. It's the consecration of a church. We've got two on that subject. Hallowed this dwelling where the Lord abideth. This is none other than the gate of heaven. Strangers and pilgrims seeking home eternal pass through its portals. Well, we are now looking at Jasper Ridley's Elizabeth I, The Shrewdness of Virtue. And we're looking at the book flap. In the summer of 1533, an answer to the most important political question of the day was eagerly awaited all over England and Western Europe. Rulers, as they returned from the hunt, asked about it. Ambassadors in London held back their messages while they added the latest news and the postscripts to their dispatches. Merchants, pondering on the risks of a rupture in trade relations between England and the Low Countries, discussed it with their factors. Would the expected baby of King Henry VIII of England and his new queen, Anne Boleyn, be a boy or girl? The child was born at Greenwich Palace between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, September 7. It was a girl, to the dismay of his parents, of King Henry's loyal courtiers and officials, and of Protestants throughout Europe, and to the delight of the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and his supporters everywhere. 25 years later, that baby would be crowned Queen Elizabeth I, and would rule for over 40 years in what has generally been regarded as the golden age of England, the age of Drake and Raleigh, Shakespeare, Spencer, and Johnson. Under Elizabeth, art, science, and commerce flourished as England rose dramatically in prominence and power, breaking her traditional alliance with Burgundy, subjugating the Scots, and in 1588 destroying the Spanish Armada. Jasper Ridley, the masterful biographer of Henry VIII, weaves history and biography to bring us a portrait of Henry's youngest daughter, the royal bastard of Anne Boleyn. Hesitant, indecisive, petulant, and contradictory, Elizabeth emerges from these pages as a consummate politician, the nemesis of the papists who sent Mary, Queen of Scots, to be the headsman, the champion of the Reformation who firmly established England as a Protestant nation, and the indomitable woman who transformed England from a peripheral European state into a world power. And his table of contents are always mercifully brief. Elizabeth I has got a portrait of her. I don't see any resemblance to her mother or father, but she's younger in that picture. By the same author, Nicholas Ridley, Thomas Cranmer, John Knox, Lord Palmerston, Garibaldi, the Roundheads. I haven't found that. I'd like to pick that up. The Statesman and the Fanatic, that's Cardinal Wolsey and Henry VIII. Give me a second here. Ridley and the Roundheads. I missed that one. That sounds like something out of the 17th century England War. Maybe not. War of Roses, I don't know. Another picture of Queen Elizabeth here. A little bit older, slender, panel attributed to Federico Zuccaro, 1575. Jasper Ridley. This was published in first American edition, 1988. To my daughter, Barbara. Acknowledgements. Tunbridge Wells. Contents. Large, just a little bit. Notes on the number one Protestant child, Lady Elizabeth, the Lord Admiral, the Tower, the heir to the throne, the coronation, the Protestant realm, John Knox, victory in Scotland, Lord Robert, defeat in France, the tolerant Queen, Mary Queen of Scots, in defense of monarchy, the revolt in the Netherlands, contest with Alva, the massacre of St. Bartholomew, Puritans and Anabaptists, the rift with Spain, the Virgin Queen, Ireland, the Jesuits, intervention in the Netherlands, execution of a queen, Cadiz, the Armada, mutinies, failures, Essex, the old queen, the end. He's such a masterful, colorful writer. Illustrations of Elizabeth Thomas Seymour, Edward Courtney, Queen Mary I and Philip II, Robert Dudley, Richard Seymour, Francis Walsingham, the launching of English fire ships against the First Armada in the Calais Road around 28 July 1588. Sources of illustrations. He's had access to this, that, and the other. Notes on the calendar. When Elizabeth was born, all Western Europe used the Julian calendar, which was 10 days behind our modern Gregorian calendar. In England and Scotland, the year began on 25 March. In France and Netherlands on Easter Day, and in Spain, Italy, and parts of Germany on 1 January. In 1582, Pope Gregory promulgated our modern Gregorian calendar, which was introduced in Spain in October, in France, the Netherlands, and Catholic countries. Elizabeth wished to introduce it into England, but abandoned the idea in view of the opposition of both bishops and Puritans to a calendar which had been approved by the Pope. The Gregorian calendar was not introduced to England until 1752. In the years between December 1582 and Elizabeth's death in 1603, the calendar was therefore 10 days behind the calendar in France, Spain, and the Netherlands. I have adopted the universal practice of giving the date of the year throughout in the Gregorian New Style calendar. Preface. Elizabeth I was a controversial figure in her lifetime and has ever been since. To her loyal Protestant subjects, she was the precious jewel of the realm of England, whom God regarded as the apple of his eye, our sovereign sacred princess, upon whose life so many lives depend. To her Catholic enemies, this woman hated of God and man, the very shame of her sex and princely name. Elizabeth hated and feared the Protestant extremists, the Puritans, as much as, perhaps more than, she hated and feared the Catholics, but they saw her as the national leader in the fight against the foreign papist enemies, and with very few exceptions, they never ventured to criticize her openly. After her struggle, the struggle between the Puritans and the monarchy began to get sharper, and the parliamentary leaders under James I And Charles I compared the good old days of Queen Elizabeth with the tyranny of the Stuart kings. It was not until the 18th century, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, that the victorious Whigs could criticize Elizabeth, seeing her in historical perspective as a despot who nevertheless used her position to advance the cause of constitutional freedom before its champions were strong enough in the 17th century to fight for it themselves. In this respect, the Whig and Marxist interpretations of the 16th and 17th centuries broadly coincide. But religious and historical differences are not the only factors which influence people's opinions about Elizabeth. By 1840, a writer who was a staunch upholder of the Church of England and who hated both Oliver Cromwell and James II wrote about Elizabeth I. Good Queen Bess was ever name, so grossly misapplied. The scourge of man, fair woman's shame, the vixen lived and died. Today, the religious hatreds have passed away in England and America, and the conflict between the Catholic and Protestants in the 16th century Europe can be seen not as a struggle between true and false religion, but as another phase in the never-ending contest in which the conservative upholders of the established order, the revolutionary youth, the martyrs, the careerists, and the foreign officers of the great powers all played their part. The public's attitude to Elizabeth seems now to be determined largely by nationality. I have not conducted an opinion poll to discover the public reaction to her, but from my personal experience, a clear majority of the English admire her, though a substantial minority dislike her. However, an even larger minority of Scots and Irish are very hostile. To nearly all the Scots, she is still the Jezebel, that English whore who will never be given for murdering our queen, though none of the actions which she sanctioned caused her more distress and remorse than the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Froude's 12-volume History of England, from the fall of Wolsey to the defeat of the Spanish Armada, of which nearly 7 volumes are devoted to Elizabeth's reign, presented a critical view of her. Froude, who had started out with the traditional admiration for Elizabeth, became convinced in the course of his research that all the credit for the great achievements of her reign must go to her ministers, above all to the great William Cecil, Lord Burghley, and not to her. During the next 80 years, many authors agreed with Froude, including Lytton Strachey in his Elizabeth and Essex in 1928, while several others followed Agnes Strickland's Lives of the Queens of England of the 1840s in showing the waywardness and the spiteful side of Elizabeth's character and relations with her intimates. Sir John Neale's great biography was published as long as 1934, though many readers today can hardly believe it. Neale swung public opinion once more in Elizabeth's favor. He's generally regarded today as her unqualified admirer. It has been said that he was so much in love with her that he could not really be objective about her. He is not, in fact, as uncritical in his later writings, especially in his Elizabeth I and her parliaments, as in the earlier, more popular, and more selective biography of 1934, in which he presented her as a great national leader, as well as an attractive person whose acts of cruelty must be excused by the period in which she lived, and whose apparent hesitations and vacillations were cunning and brilliant diplomatic maneuvers, unscrupulous perhaps, but justified in the interests of England. Elizabeth Jenkins in 1958 fully shared Neil's admiration. His opinion that the Queen, and not her ministers, was responsible for the glories of the Elizabethan age has been put forth even more forcibly by Paul Johnson, both in his biography of 1974 and in his contribution to Queen Elizabeth, Most Politic Princess, in 1986. In England, Neil still reigns supreme. For Sir Geoffrey Elton's criticism has been confined to arguing that Neil exaggerated the influence and organization of the Puritans in the House of Commons. In recent years, only an American biographer, Carolee Erickson, who is an erudite historian, has damned Elizabeth as a hateful shrew who made life unbearable for her unfortunate courtiers and ministers. When writing this book, I have often been asked, always by people who have read nothing by Neil except the biography, whether I found anything new to say about Elizabeth since Neil. This shows the extent of Neil's influence, but it is a surprising question. Apart from the fact that Elizabeth Jenkins, Edith Sitwell, Paul Johnson, and Carolee Erickson have all written their very successful biographies since 1934, Neil's biography contained virtually no unpublished material. In this sense, Neil wrote nothing new since Froude, though this, of course, does not apply to Neil's other books or to his other articles in learned journals. What was new about Neil's Queen Elizabeth was his interpretation of her character and influence, which reversed Froude. It is possible today for a new biographer of Elizabeth to discover at least a limited amount of unpublished material, particularly about Ireland, a subject which has been examined in specialized studies by a number of English and Irish authors, but has always been entirely ignored by Elizabeth's biographers. It is also possible to quote correctly for the first time several well-known phrases from contemporary documents which have been incorrectly quoted for over 100 years. In the 19th century, great historians like Froude and Motley saw nothing wrong in paraphrasing passages from 16th century letters and putting their paraphrases within quotation marks as if they were actually quoting from the document. In many cases, all other authors have used these quotations ever since. As long as historians and biographers wish to write and the readers wish to read about Elizabeth, they will be able to find a new interpretation of the character and place in history of this complex, contradictory, bewildering, and fascinating woman. My Elizabeth I is not Neil's heroine, not Elizabeth Jenkins, Elizabeth the Great, nor Paul Johnson's Most Politic Princess, and not the vixen of the poet of 1842 and of Carolee Erickson in 1984. I see Elizabeth as a very religious and conscientious woman, a convinced Protestant, determined to do her duty as she saw it, to God and her people, and to uphold the prestige and power of the absolute monarchy for this reason. She was overwhelmed by her sense of responsibility as a queen, which she did not enjoy, and for which she had sacrificed her love for Leicester. This was why she could never make up her mind what to do in moments of crisis, and would so often change her mind. Nevertheless, in the last resort, it was she alone who had to make the decisions, and she always did so when it was really necessary. Sometimes these decisions were wrong, and had disastrous results. But on the most important occasions, for example, in Scotland in 1559, they were right. She deserves credit for them. References. He's such a good writer. We love this man's historical research. He's got a great biography on Cranmer. I fault him a few places, but I want to see more theology, which he doesn't bring in so much as I would like. The Protestant child in the summer of 1533. And boy, a lot happened from November 1552 to the summer of 1533. To study that is like, that was choreographed down to the last detail. So we're jumping in here with a pregnant Anne Boleyn. We'll skip a lot of the details, but Archbishop Cranmer is doing the bidding of his master, the royal master, Henry VIII. All over England and Western Europe, everyone interested in public affairs was eagerly awaiting the answer of the most important question of the day. The kings and rulers, as they returned from the hunt, asked their secretaries about it. The ambassadors, probably Eustace Chapuis, our favorite Spanish ambassador, held back their messengers with their saddled horses in the courtyards of the embassies while they added the latest news and postscripts to their dispatches. The merchants, pondering on the risks of a rupture in trade relations between England and the Low Countries, discussed it with their factors. Would the expected baby of King Henry VIII of England and his new queen, Anne Boleyn, be a boy or girl? The child was born at Greenwich Palace between 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Sunday, September 7th. It was a girl, to the dismay of her parents, of King Henry's loyal courtiers and officials, and of the Protestants throughout Europe, and to the delight of the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, their supporters everywhere, including perhaps the majority of the English people. 25 years later, the baby became Queen Elizabeth. As far as her personality was concerned, she inherited very little from either her father or her mother. She had Henry's red hair, his intelligence, his physical energy, and his ebullient personality, but not his ability to make rapid decisions, his cold, calculating cruelty, his utter lack of conscience, and his disregard of everything except his own personal advantage and pleasure. She had Anne Boleyn's vivacity and charm, but not her daring and her irresponsibility. But Elizabeth's destiny and all her actions were determined by the fact that she was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, of a father who was a ruthless despot, a national leader against the hated foreigner, and a conservative in religion, but also of a mother who represented, in the eyes of friends and enemies, subversive Protestantism, the revolutionary movement of the century. 15 years before Elizabeth was born, England was a country in which state and church combined to regulate the lives of the people, who were forbidden to export goods or to travel without permits, to eat meat on the fast days, to fornicate, wear clothes or colors of their social superiors, or to criticize the king or his counselors, or the dignitaries or doctrines of the church. A few dissidents, the Lollards, put forward new religious ideas, but they were arrested and tried as heretics before the ecclesiastical courts. And if they refused to recant, they were burned alive in the nearest market town. They were hailed as martyrs by a small number of supporters, but gained very little sympathy from most of the English people, though the ordinary Englishman was always ready to laugh at jokes about the immorality of priests, monks, and nuns, and grumbled about the interference and extortions of the foreign pope and his officials in Rome. On 31 October 1517, Martin Luther, a monk at Wittenberg in Saxony, nailed a document to the church in Wittenberg in which he denounced a particularly scandalous example of papal corruption. If the Pope and church authorities had been prepared to accept his criticism in a sympathetic way, nothing more might have been heard of him. But he was violently denounced as a presumptuous heretic, and this drove him to make more far-reaching attacks on the papacy. By 1521, his followers all over North Germany were rioting and breaking images in the churches, and soon large areas of Germany and Northern Europe had repudiated the Pope's authority. In England, Lutheranism spread rapidly among those sections of the population which were receptive to revolutionary ideas. The artisans of the towns in the economically advanced areas of southeast England, the discontented youth, the intellectuals of Cambridge University, especially the priests and divinity students. Oxford was less affected, but here and in many other places the movement spread. The Lutherans, as all the dissidents were now inaccurately called, advocated new doctrines and practices in the church, all of which had one thing in common. They denigrated the status of the priesthood and emphasized the direct relationship between the individual layman and God. They thought that the congregation at Mass should share the wine with the priest. They condemned the doctrine of the celibacy of the clergy and of monks and nuns, and believed that priests should marry instead of openly living with a concubine, as many priests and bishops did. They denied the real presence, the doctrine that the priest, by his words at Mass, could transubstantiate the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. And they taught that Christ was only spiritually and figuratively present in the bread and wine when the congregation commemorated the Lord's Supper. They condemned images of the church and even the crucifix. They rejected the splendid vestments of the church in which the clergy dressed, thought that bishops and priests should officiate in ordinary clothes. Above all, the reformers believed that all men and women should read and accept the truth of the Bible and reject every ceremony, doctrine and ceremony, which had been added by the church without scriptural authority. And here we'll unfortunately draw this to a close. It's a very nice little introduction here as we get going on Elizabeth. Lord, hymn 360, verse 5, we beseech thee as we throng thy temple by the past blessings, by past bounty. Favor thy children, and with tender mercy hear our petitions. Let us pray. Blessing and honor and glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne, both now to the Lamb forever and ever. Amen. Godspeed.